Hi, welcome to another episode of Voices Talk Show. This is actually our season finale, and I'm really excited because we actually made it to this point, and this episode is kind of like a full circle moment from the pilot episode where my husband actually got to talk about his story, and I think that it's really important that we actually have this conversation openly and vulnerably and just kind of humanize the topic around the Black and brown police experience. I think since moving here 4 years ago, one of the things that was most important to me about starting this show was to just be able to have these conversations openly and to bring a little bit more exposure to it and to make it a normal conversation, a conversation that is not filled with anxiety. And even though it is, because it's still so new, I just want you guys to feel comfortable in being here, and I really appreciate you actually taking the moment to sit down with me and do this. So I want to go ahead and give you guys an opportunity to introduce yourselves, so if you want to go ahead and start.
My name is Lanau Ciceron. I've been a member of this community for 4 years now, a husband to Josette, and a father of 3.
My name is Josette Ciceron. I'm actually from the city's military veteran, father and stepfather of 5 and 4 children. I'm a distant community member here. My family's lived here pretty much my whole life, so I've been here for months upon, during the year. But no, I love it up in Alec in a sense, so I'm happy to be here. So.
Cool, thanks.
Hi, good morning. My name's Scott Kent, community member for 19 plus years. I have 3 children and my wife. We've lived in a couple different homes in the community. I worked for the police department for the last 19 years in some various positions, and just intricately involved in all aspects of community, from some volunteer stuff to problem solving to policing. So,
Good. Well, thank you for being here again. Let's go ahead and just jump right into the conversation. So why do you think that police brutality and racial profiling is such a sensitive conversation for all people to have?
Well,
I'll default to you guys, and then I can jump in.
I was raised seeing things on the media, things that I've seen in real life growing up in St. Paul. And so this extends all around the country. It's not just in Alec, it's not just in the cities. It can happen anywhere, but all depends, just situational type things. But if something were to happen, it's not reported. It seems like a lot of people of color don't report these things because we feel there might be retaliation, something you might be segregated in a sense, or just, it just, when you grow up that way in families in poverty, it seems that things become negative, that you're already against the wall. There's no help in that. And some people you see it, and it's systematic. It can be that, or it can just be a family that just has never went forward and they just continue that way. And it's a cycle. That needs to change though. People need to feel like everybody has rights. We all do have the same rights in a sense, but sometimes you just see it, from a view, the media's pushing something that you don't have the facts upon, and it creates a stigma in a sense. And sometimes, you gotta do your research. You gotta go be open and talk to other people.
What do you think?
Yeah, see, for us back home, it was more like we didn't think anyone would do anything about it anyway. We didn't think anybody cared. That's back in Florida, yes. It's more like, even if you did report it, no one cared, so just let it go anyway. So we didn't really care about that sort of thing. We just kind of got used to it, kind of got numb to it, and just expected it in a sense.
Like that was just kind of the way things were. Yeah. I think there's a conversation there. Well, I know that in the Black community, especially, or in the community of color in general, a lot of times, like our version of the birds and the bees is, how do you interact with law enforcement? It's something that I've seen lots of men in my family have this conversation with, our elders, and it's just because there's this history of being targeted. There's this history of stereotypes and things that unfortunately, when you don't live in that skin and live in those experiences, you don't understand how sensitive it can be, how frightening it can be. And nowadays, it's life-threatening. It's something that is on our minds in our community very often. I think being in this community, and particularly, it's important that we're bringing awareness to that conversation and we're discussing it openly, because while there might not be a huge population of people of color, that doesn't mean that they're not out there and experiencing the same things that you would anywhere else. Here might be a little bit more heightened because we are in a homogenous community where those are things that we're kind of used to now, getting stared at or being followed in a store, or just little things that would be normal to everyone else and that maybe isn't a big deal, but when it happens as often as it does, it becomes a very big deal and something that we shouldn't be afraid to discuss. So, what do you think?
I come back to your story, all three of your stories, and they come back to there's something that we're missing in the conversation, is what is historical and generational trauma, and the trauma that's reinforced through generations and families and stories, and that's a piece that isn't appreciated or even understood, what generational and historical trauma really entail. And if we get down to understanding what some of that is, it helps us open up to understand some of those nuances that come with that. See, being a white man that's lived in North Dakota and Minnesota, that's normal for me. And we talked before we started filming about size and height, and walking into a room and not even understanding the effects that you may have on a room, being somebody that's 6 foot tall. Yep. And walking into a room, being 6 foot tall and being a white man, I don't understand what that brings into a room, especially into a room with people of color. I've never experienced the other side of that. So when we start talking about those experiences, it's hard to even relate and understand those experiences without having some empathy and compassion for those stories, and understanding that there is historical and generational situations. My experience with police brutality goes back to Rodney King. If there's a set in time, a marker to say, when did you experience your first police brutality situation? It was a Rodney King situation that was, spread across this country. And then recently, it would be Michael Brown in St. Louis area. And then as close to home as Philando Castilla. Yeah. So we've got those different things that move closer, that hit closer to home. As far as LA, that, Rodney King, that's way out there. But in law enforcement, we had a lot of different training things that came with that. And we've seen different things within our police agencies on every single of those significant events. Yeah. And, the community doesn't always see or understand what some of those changes are. Some of them work positively, and some of them kind of go against the intended purpose.
Yeah, I agree. I think that when I started having these conversations, especially when we connected a few months ago, the first thing that you talked about was about your implicit bias training and how you've gone through different, methods of education to understand, those things, and what does implicit bias mean to the everyday person. So in your own words, what do you think that means, and why is it relative to this conversation?
I think for law enforcement, it's everything that they are seeing in the media is what kind of fuels their implicit bias. Yeah, it's terrible when you just get assumed when you get pulled over that if it's in the middle of the night, at nighttime, you're obviously doing something wrong because of what time it is, versus someone else who may not be of color that get pulled over and get treated completely differently. It's a totally different experience depending on the person and whether it's day or night. Well, and a lot of times it doesn't even matter what time of day it is, because, well, we get pulled over, 20% more than our white counterparts, which is pretty high number, and apparently whether it's day or night doesn't really make a difference in it either. So.
No, and going off what you're saying and just being in a small town, knowing that you might be stereotyped or discriminated upon, and being a person of color, aware where you go, what time, you might not want to go out to the bar, since, like right here, knowing that majority of the people in there are going to be, Caucasian, and you might be the 1% in there, and that something happens negative, you might be the one looked at no matter what you did. And it's part of that. I mean, it's part of the stigma right there. And it's something I wish I didn't carry with me, but I've carried it pretty much my whole life. So
It's kind of a second, I don't know if it ever becomes truly second nature, but it's a conscious thing that you do. Even being a Black woman, I still feel those things. I still feel the need to, there is a feeling that you get when a police officer drives past, or if you're being pulled over, the first thing you think of is what am I doing wrong? What's the, and then even then there's still this extra fear of wow, I need to be calm. I don't look a certain way. Don't ask too many questions. And it's interesting because I don't think that that's the experience overall for a lot of my white friends. When we talk about it, they're like, I never think twice about, calling the cops. And in our situation, it's someone needs to be bleeding out of that before, you do that, just because it's so easy for things to be escalated and to be switched around, and you don't ever really see it coming. I think when you mentioned Philando Castile, that for me, that was probably not the only, but that was one of the first situations that really hit home. And that's because in 2016, right around that same time, that was when we experienced, being in that situation ourselves, of just interacting with the police, and it being a mistaken situation where it wasn't even us. And I wasn't part of that, but just being your wife and you coming home and telling me that day, I can still remember recalling that and thinking, oh my gosh, anything could have happened, and I'm very blessed and lucky that I'm with somebody who is street smart and who has that second level of consciousness of knowing, I shouldn't, because in any other situation, someone who's scared, who's never interacted with the law before, if you know something's not right, or you didn't do anything wrong, your natural instinct is to defend yourself, and that might sound angry, and there's something about our skin that tends to be more threatening when we are emotional, and at least that's what it seems from the other side. And so I think that it's hard for people to understand that walk of life if you're not in it every day, but it really is a real thing. It really is something that we all experience, whether you're, doing things or not doing things. You just kind of always are on guard, and it's kind of a cultural, thing that is kind of embedded in us to understand that you are not going to be treated the same way, and you need to be prepared with the tools to do that. And in that situation, especially with Philando Castile, that was one of those classic situations where he did everything it felt like that you're supposed to do, and it still ended in his life being taken away, and that was in broad daylight. So I think having those thoughts in my head, especially during that summer, the summer of 2016, it changed me completely, and it was the driving force behind me wanting to have these conversations more often. So with that in mind, what are your personal experiences with this, and what stands out to you most when it comes to this conversation?
As it refers to implicit biases, when I go into the classroom and we talk about implicit biases, we talk about it being universal, that we all have implicit bias, and there's such a negative connotation around what biases are. And they're natural, they're normal, and everybody has them. And they're based off of life experiences. And I don't want to get on my soapbox on teaching or talking about what that is. But if we don't self-check some of those and start challenging ourselves to what we feel and get into, if we don't start checking those, we're just going to continue to perpetuate those same biases. You all have biases towards law enforcement based on historical and generation and stories being reinforced in what you see on media. And when you see tragic events happen, that just overlays your biases towards law enforcement, largely negative.
Yeah.
And the same goes for us. We're all people, and we just have different jobs and different professions, and we see things differently based on those life experiences. So we need to continue to challenge ourselves and check those. Me as well, I'm not, everybody, to go, why am I thinking that? What's happening to bring me to those conclusions? And you know, like we said before when we first met, I can't take those stories away, but I also can't put myself in your situation to understand that. I want to, but I can't.
Yeah. I think it starts with education, and we're all doing that. I think we all have like a responsibility to go out there and kind of educate ourselves. What do you think though, Jason, in terms of like how it feels to be in those positions? Do you think that there are things that there are misconceptions that other people just don't understand when it comes to actually be in that position yourself?
Yeah, I mean, you look at the numbers. I mean, it's sometimes there's 0 people of color in a town, and it's a lot of Midwest. I mean, it could be anywhere in the country. It's just, you know, people are moving and they're relocating for jobs, and sometimes you come across, I mean, it could be anybody, any type of ethnic background, diversity, but it's now, have they been educated in their police force or in the town fire department? And you know, it might only be 200 people in the town, but to have a family, you know, of people of color to move in there is just, it's new to them. It's something they might have never seen. The kids might question, like, why do these people look like that? So, and I mean, in the city here, I've seen it, looking at the negative and changing that is something that my experience in the military, growing up with all type of diversity in the city, because it's not like it is up here in the city. It's everybody is everybody. We're a mixed group down there. But here, I mean, in the stores, just walking, having like some of my stepchildren might be light complected, people look different at that. And it's something that I'm learning to just, you know, to address it to somebody walking, say that they might be defensive, or there can be that. So it's, what do? Do you go talk to somebody in the police force? There's really not an outlet for that, to say for us to go do that, because so what do you do that and bring to your family? And that's where, again, the conversations that don't leave the homes, it becomes where we just hold them in, and it's internal.
And I think that's the barrier I want to break. I want it to be okay, because we can't change anything. We can't understand. We can't even begin to understand each other if we're not willing to talk about it and say these things out loud and say them in front of the police officer that you're nervous to talk about it with, because it is real, it's happening. And I think if we give people the opportunity to kind of look inwards and see that, then they can just be like, oh, okay, well, why is that, and question that more and find that out for themselves, because we do experience those things on a daily basis. We're all kind of family, and the kids in our family all look different. Some are white, some are black, some are mixed, some you can't even tell, and we experience all the time going out with them and seeing how people react to that. We're not used to seeing the differences, and in a community like this where we don't see that exposure, I think we kind of need to be a little bit even more considerate of that, and not be afraid of it, not to be afraid to ask those questions, because I welcome it. I welcome being able to talk about these things that are so difficult and nuanced, because because it's that level of like trying not to offend somebody, but it does happen. I think it's starting by acknowledging it is a good place, first step. I do see that. I experience it with you. I even feel bad just sometimes when I realize like that person who like clenched their purse a little tighter because you walked by them, or I see it all the time, and it's kind of like we just have to exist in that space, and no, it shouldn't be that way, but it is, and just like you said, we have our own biases that are culturally embedded in us. What are some steps as a community we can take to actually address these things head on?
For me, I feel like it does start with the children here, because that is a big problem I feel in this town, is that the kids are completely uneducated on biases and these things that they're saying. All types of this. Our kids, they're not our kids, but our nieces and nephews, they're experiencing it now. We hear the stories from them. Because they look so different, they get to see how it feels to be the other person, even though they're all of color. You can't tell that from looking at all of them. So it's as if one gets treated better than the other, and then the other gets to see that and sees that, oh, that's just okay. I wish my color, my skin may be a shade lighter, so then I wouldn't get treated that badly.
And it goes, when it comes to that, like they're being raised in that environment, and so they become what we are now, where you're kind of like a little extra, fearful of this or that, and I want my kids, our nieces, our families, I want these children to grow up feeling secure, because being raised by first generation immigrants, we didn't all they knew, and my parents, they were very into like the news, and so they saw all the things that we saw with the Rodney Kings and all that, and all they knew was that, okay, it is not a positive thing to be black in this country, so you need to walk a different way and act a different way, and that was just kind of always the conversation. And I want my kids to be able to pick up the phone and when they're in danger and not have an extra level of like what's going to happen next. I also want people to realize that even if these things are happening everywhere, that we still have the power to make a difference and affect change in a positive way by having those conversations. And while we might not have all the answers, it's still important to discuss it openly. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions when it comes to all this, and I think part of the reasons why those misconceptions exist is because we're not, having the conversations around it. As a police officer in this community, do you feel like there are things that the police department could be doing differently to help the community come to terms with these experiences, or to even understand it better?
It's a great question, and I recently picked up a book called Emergent Strategies by Adrienne Brown, who also, and there's a number of strategies to move communities forward. And she also references, in one of hers, is Stephen Covey, who quotes or writes about move at the speed of trust. In order to move communities, in order to effectively make long-term change, you have to develop trusted relationships. And in order to make trusted relationships, we need to sit down and have coffee and build those relationships. We can educate, we can train, but if we're not trusting in those environments, the training is kind of all for naught. We can check the box and say, yep, we've trained, we've educated, but if we don't continue to move those partnerships and relationships towards a trusted path, it's going to be pretend. Yep. It's not real. So how do we effectively move communities is through challenging one another, building trust with one another, and really getting to know and understand each other's stories. How do we do that? We're four people and we have four influences, and some of those influences are going to cross over because of family relations, because of friend relations. But in order to do that, we have to take that sphere of influence and start to multiply it, build those relationships, And then once those relationships are built, then we start to challenge and bring these conversations into that. I believe that if we bring those conversations too early, we don't have the trust built, and it's not going to effectively work. So strategically, we're trying to always cultivate, or at least I am trying to cultivate new relationships so I can learn about what's in our community. And I think if we continue to do that and build trust, that's how we move.
What do you guys think? Your final thoughts?
No. And briefly going off what you said about how this comes together is the youth, but also the education part, because the youth eventually will become the leaders in the police force, fire department, local businesses, everything. It's them seeing, if it's pictures of Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, they don't normally see them, maybe in a brief history lesson, but it's not taught like the way we were taught, in the sense of these are our heroes, these are the people we look up to, and they have changed our history, the landscape of that. In a sense, up here there's different teachings, so it's maybe doing a potluck of traditional Caribbean food in here, or something from Mexico, or something native food into a community building here, and people seeing that, and people that don't look exactly like them, but introduce them to a different culture, and hopefully these things start to happen more. So
for me, just as far as the police force goes, the implicit bias training, I'm not sure if the regular training, if there could be more put into it, but if the police was taught to really, like you just said, interact with the community more, maybe people of our color, interact with us in more positive sense, I feel like that would actually, that would help quite a bit. Yeah, that would help.
Yep.
And I think that would actually push things forward, especially if the kids see that too. They see that we have positive interactions with the police force. It's not everything you see on TV.
Yeah. And I think that's important, is to start replacing some of those negative, images with positive ones. Like he said, actually taking the time to go within those communities, and even in this community where it seems so small and it seems like the community of color is hidden, in a sense, I think we're not really hidden. We're here. We're just, there's more attention put in the culture in general on the predominant culture, which is the white community. And so it probably takes a little bit more effort on all of our parts to actually see those people and go in those communities and actually engage with them. We're actually doing really positive things already through the Inclusion Network. The Complexity Initiative has a potluck every single month where we invite people of color, especially, and their allies, to sit down and break bread and bring a dish and just kind of come together and share stories and talk about stories like ours, and talk about these things regularly, just because you can't talk about it too much, and the more we talk about it, the more we destigmatize it, the more we humanize the conversation, and show that there's a whole nother side of this. There's so many layers to the Black and brown police experience, to racial inequalities in general, whether it's systematic or in our everyday lives. And I think we are taking a bold step forward just in doing this and having these conversations and doing this together. So I really appreciate you guys all being here and taking a moment to do this with me. It's such an important conversation to keep having. I challenge everyone in the community to do this in your homes and continue to have these conversations too. And this was the perfect thing to end our season on, and I really encourage everyone to continue to get educated and continue to watch the videos and have these conversations and make it a normal part of your social interactions. So thank you again.
Thanks.
Thank you for watching the very final episode of Voices Talk Show Season 1. We're so excited because this was such a big project for us. We didn't really know what we were doing, and it just kind of turned into so much more than we imagined it would be. And so we're really excited to move on to a Season 2. So we need your help to do that. Definitely continue to watch the videos, share them on social media with your friends. But we also encourage the community opportunity to get involved. If you are a business identity or an organization and you want to sponsor us, definitely reach out to us at 320-762-4466 or at voicestalkshow@gmail.com. So yes, thank you for actually being part of this and watching our videos and continuing to support us. We really are excited that we got to do this, and we want to invite other communities outside of Alexandria to jump on board and help. So if you have any questions, definitely give us a call and continue to support us. Thank you so much.